Here, but I appreciate your patience and your tolerance of everybody's personal space. My name is Miles Lewis. I'm the founder and president of the Anomaly Archives, which is the 501c3 lending library of the Scientific Anomaly Institute. The massive amount of books that you see around you is a portion of that collection, and we exist thanks to the wonderful generosity of my fellow friends and fellow board members of the INACS, the Institute for Neuroscience and Consciousness Studies, whose offices we are inhabiting for this event. My interest in all these phenomena started with an interest in psychic phenomena, ESP, clairvoyance, and precognitive dreams, but I've always had a fascination, a deep obsession with the subject of UFOs, as most of you already know. And I was lucky enough to meet this gentleman, Paul Smith, in about 2002, interviewed him for a publication called The Awesome Pair of Times, and then he was one of our first speakers for the Anomaly Archives in 2005, and then I had the pleasure of interviewing him for my radio show in 2010. Links to all that stuff is on our website, and every time I listen to this man speak, I learn something new and interesting, and
not necessarily true, but new and interesting.
And his appreciation of the pitfalls and promise of this alternative mode of finding information is of much interest to all of y'all, obviously. So I will hand it over to Mr. Paul Smith.
Thank you.
And looking forward to hearing about this subject.
So actually, we met a lot earlier in 2002. You came over to my house and interviewed me in 2002, but we probably met in 97, 98, not long after I got here, I don't think.
Could have been that.
The circumstances I no longer remember, but I'm sure I met you. I know I met you before that. So all right. And where were you all guys last time? I mean, yeah, some of you were here. Some of you were here, right? I remember that. But we had a few empty seats the last time. This time we don't even have places to have empty seats. That's pretty impressive. Yeah, I should have talked about UFOs last time instead of intuition, right? Yeah. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about remote viewing and UFOs, as you can see emblazoned on our TV set here. And it's an interesting topic and has been a hot topic for about 20 years now. The interesting thing, there's lots of interesting things, I'll say that a lot, you'll get tired of me saying it, but one of the interesting things is that as soon as remote viewing became public, almost instantly UFOs were linked up to it. And that's because back when it was still secret, UFOs were linked up to remote viewing. Okay, so the first question is, how many of you, is there anyone here who's not overly familiar with remote viewing? You generally know, does everybody generally know what it is? Because I'm assuming that from the start on this talk. If I had to explain remote viewing, we'd be here until tomorrow. So, okay. Anybody here feel like they're a little weak? I'll say a few extra things.
I do.
Okay. All right. So remote viewing was, just to cut to the chase, essentially a psychic skill, a clairvoyant sort of a skill that was developed by the military. But it was developed in a scientific laboratory, and the originator of it is a gentleman named Ingo Swann, who's now passed on as of 2013. And a scientist who actually lives here in Austin. Now, he didn't at the time, Hal Puthoff. I'll be talking about both of them a little bit. The idea behind remote viewing, they call it remote viewing, but it really should have been called remote perception. And the reason for that is because not only do you see things, but you smell, hear, and taste and touch things as well. Now, when I say that, it's not in the same sense that I'm touching this podium, or I could reach over and ruffle up his hair if I wanted to, but I wouldn't dare do that to Jim. And I certainly can't do it to me. You can do all of those things, but the experience is, I like to liken it to a half-remembered memory. It comes in vaguely, it comes in subtly, and sometimes you don't even know you have any experience at all, but all of a sudden you have an impression and you don't know where it came from and you put it down. And it's a very rigorous approach. You're not going to go out and see angels, or you're not channeling somebody. There's all kinds of, those are all different kinds of modalities, and they're not remote viewing. Remote viewing is a specific way of perceiving, I like to call it controlled clairvoyance. You're essentially perceiving, experience other locations than where you are, and you bring back that information, you record it, you sketch it. One of the key elements of remote viewing is you have an actual concrete report on paper or video or whatever your medium is, that you can actually show to other people. It produces objective evidence, which you can then compare to the target. And I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along. But that's probably an inadequate introduction, but it's at least better than you had 5 minutes ago, right? Okay, good. So, remote viewing and UFOs. The question always comes up, why did remote viewing get linked up with UFOs? And it always makes me think of a quote from Winston Churchill when he was asked what the Soviets were going to do during World War II. He said, essentially, that's a riddle wrapped up in a mystery inside an enigma. But perhaps there is a key, right? Okay. And in a way, there is actually a connection here, not with the Russians, although there is actually a connection with the Russians because we started doing remote viewing because the Russians were doing remote viewing, you know. But the thing here is that UFOs are a mystery, right? We don't know what remote, excuse me, what UFOs are. We have a lot of speculative ideas, and I'll tell you what I think about them here in a minute. And we have been unable to actually get to ground truth with UFOs using our standard scientific approach. The presumption is that if they would sit still long enough to be examined, we could probably do it. You should be able to examine a UFO with our scientific instrumentation. But they appear to involve an advanced culture, an advanced science that has been so far really hard for us to use our own science on to figure out what they are, what they're doing, and why they're doing it. Okay. So they're a mystery. Well, remote viewing, which is a mental skill, extrasensory perception, which modern science has a real difficult time using its instrumentation to detect and understand how it works, right, is another kind of a mystery. And so way back, not just when everything became public, but way back in the early stages of the remote viewing program, clear back as far as the early 70s, the obvious linkage here comes out. It's not that remote viewing and UFOs are linked, it's that remote viewing is a tool that we can use to find out information about targets that are otherwise inaccessible to us. UFOs are otherwise inaccessible to us. Why don't we use remote viewing to find out about UFOs? Well, of course, there you have a mystery exploring another mystery, right? And it seems like a paradox, but you could at least understand the logic why people want to do that. It kind of makes sense. And in fact, it makes a lot of sense when you go right down to it. And it has some potential to succeed. Right? All right. So I'm going to talk about some of the characters involved in remote viewing. And for those of you who aren't a little unfamiliar with the history, the remote viewing program started in 1972 and it ended in 1995. And by the time it ended, its main name had become known as Stargate. It didn't start off with that name, but when it ended, it was called Stargate. And so generally speaking, in the official records, when they say Stargate program, they're referring to the entire thing all the way back to 1972. Okay? So when I say Stargate, I'm talking about the remote viewing program. And I'm going to first go through a list of these personalities who were involved in both Stargate and remote viewing. And then I'm going to go into a little more detail after that, various aspects of this. So the first one was Ingo Swann. Okay? Anybody here, who here has not heard of Ingo Swann? Okay, a few of you. Okay, so, I mean, other than when I said it about 3 minutes ago, right? So, Ingo Swann was, he was born in Telluride, Colorado, grew up in Utah, ended up in the Army in Korea, and finally ended up in New York City wanting to develop an art career in what he called cosmic art. It was kind of like, and I should have put some photos in here of his art. I didn't think about that. You can think of it as surrealism meets. It is a non-nightmare version of surrealism. I consider surrealism to be kind of nightmarish in quality, and this was a more hopeful, positive kind of a way of looking at it. Cosmic art involved a lot of space, kind of like space art in a way meets surrealism. You can think of it that way. And he was exploring that as well as other kinds of art. As a kid, he had experiences in out-of-body. He had out-of-body experiences, which his mother's mother supported and helped him and encouraged him in, because nobody else would. You know the story. You have an out-of-body experience. You have some kind of psychic experience. Nobody in your family, they think you're a little wacko. They think you're nice but crazy. You know, that kind of thing, right? And his grandmother, however, had similar experiences, and so she was kind of his mentor. Well, when he got to New York, that was right in the middle of kind of an awakening in parapsychology research. And he did some experiments there and had a great deal of success with it. Ultimately ended up with this guy, Hal Puthoff. He's the one that lives here in Austin. This picture of Ingo was taken in, I want to say 2005, 2006. This picture of Hal was taken Saturday night. That's the reason I'm here. The reason I'm here is not to give you a talk on remote viewing UFOs. That was my cover story. Because his family and colleagues hosted. Yeah, well, thank you. I thought about wearing it tonight, but it's just too hot out there. Anyway, besides, it would kind of clash with this shirt, I think. But they had a surprise 80th birthday for him downtown in one of the bank towers down there, and he was totally surprised, but it was really fun. And I needed an excuse to, because if he heard I was in Austin and he didn't know why I was in Austin, he'd start to wonder what was afoot, you know. So I arranged with these guys to do this talk so that I could tell Hal, yeah, Hal, I'm coming to Austin. I want to come by on Tuesday, office visit, see how you're doing. Okay, that's fine. So on Saturday night, 3 days before Tuesday, he was very surprised to see me standing in the crowd. So anyway, but that was taken after the party. So Puthoff is here, and his laboratory is actually only about, what, a mile and a half down this road. Yeah, they have a full physics laboratory in there. It's just amazing. So anyway, so Puthoff. Now, Ingo actually remote viewed aliens and UFOs. Puthoff didn't remote view them, but he has a lifelong interest in it, and one of his hobbies on the side is trying to explore from a physics perspective how these things might work. And he's quite well known for having an interest in this, but he's not an experiencer. He's never been abducted, at least by aliens. He is not, he's not seen a UFO. He would dearly love to, but it's kind of a clearinghouse for some of these UFO reports, and anything that might reflect on the science about how they might work, he's very interested in. Yes, ma'am?
Are you talking about UFOs or remote viewing?
I'm talking about UFOs. But he did do remote viewing as well. See, this is another place where this all comes together, right? So Ingo, I don't know if I was clear about this, Ingo's the one that actually invented or discovered, or however you want to say it, remote viewing. Ingo Swann we call the father of remote viewing. He coined the term, he came up with the protocol that started it all, and then he developed the training methodology that the vast majority of people use a version of out there, called controlled remote viewing, and then there's technical remote viewing, there's scientific remote viewing, there's other flavors of controlled remote viewing. All of those are descended from the methodology that he, working with Hal Puthoff, developed. Hal was contracted by the CIA through Stanford Research Institute at the time to create a remote viewing program to find out if what the Soviets were up to really worked. And they found out it really worked. And then the folks who had asked them to find out if it worked said, well, if it works, why are we using it on our own people? Let's use it on the Soviets, you know? And so they did for 23 years. I was, for 7 years, in the program, spying on the Soviets, the Hezbollah, narco-traffickers, Chinese nuclear tests, whatever the perceived threat was at the time, we at one time or another were asked to address that. So anyway, so one of the early remote viewers was Pat Price, and I'm going to tell you a lot more about his story shortly, because he was the one that kind of got everybody into this business in a way. Okay, so there's another ufologist, Jacques Vallée. Everybody heard of Jacques Vallée, I presume, that at least if you're interested in UFOs, I'm sure you have. This is him actually in Paris with my wife and my son. We ran into him in the Latin Quarter. And it was quite fun. We were both there for a conference, so I knew he was there. But Jacques is an interesting guy because, first off, you're going to say, wait, why is he under the Stargate list here? Jacques Vallée, you know, Al Gore claimed he invented the internet. Jacques Vallée really did. Jacques Vallée was one of the 50 people who created ARPANET, which was the predecessor to the internet, and he was an advisor on the development of the internet for quite a while. He's a computer scientist, a brilliant one, widely respected. He's now a venture capitalist. And the interesting thing about this is that he ended up also being an advisor to the remote viewing program while it was at SRI. Because the guy's brilliant. He's got all kinds of great ideas. In fact, the use of coordinates, latitude and longitude, as the targeting mechanism for remote viewing was his idea. So So he's interested in UFOs, and he's also connected with Stargate. Okay? All right. Then there's Skip Atwater. Skip Atwater, who's familiar with the Monroe Institute? Quite a few of you. Maybe you're familiar with Skip Atwater from that context. Skip was the lab director of the Institute from about 1989 until, I don't know when, until he retired like 2 years ago or whatever. And he was the president of it for a while too, when there was nobody else to run it. So Skip actually, in a way, was the savior of the Monroe Institute. He kept it going when Laurie Monroe passed on, and then there was nobody really was in position to take over, and he ran it. So, but the other thing Skip did was that he directed a number of the remote viewers at Fort Meade to remote view a number of different UFO events and UFO occurrences and such. And I'll explain those a little bit too. And, you know, I'm going to promise to explain a lot of stuff. I don't know if I'll get to it all of it, but I'll do my best, okay? So another one is Joe McMoneagle. Joe McMoneagle, of course, those familiar with the Monroe Institute are likely familiar with him. I think he does the talk, still does the talk for every gateway that happens, although he's right now having some real health problems. He's always has health problems, and they're back again. So Joe he's proud of saying he's remote viewer 001 for the military program, and he was one of the earliest remote viewers in the Army that the Army used to get the program going. And he's had a number of UFO experiences, writes about them in a number of his books. I won't say too much more about him in terms of UFOs, because some of these other folks are more prominent in that regard. But he does have a UFO relationship with remote viewing. Of course, here's one that I'd say needs no introduction, but some of you probably do need to be introduced to him. This is Ed Dames. I couldn't resist this picture of him. Sorry, folks. I have one where he's much more sedate, but those are rare, hard to come by. Yeah. He was kind of hamming it up for the camera here. But Ed, of course, is famous for having been the one who actually, in public, when the remote viewing program was declassified, linking our remote viewing and UFOs. He's probably the one most famous for making that connection. And he was the one that pushed it the most, actually, while the program was still secret at Fort Meade. Okay, so the final one I'm going to mention in terms of Stargate is Lynn Buchanan. Here I'm with him here in 2013. Lynn, and I've left most of the other viewers out. For example, I don't have myself in this list. I don't have Mel Riley in this list, although I talk about one of his sessions later, because we were essentially the victims. Well, I don't know if you want to say victim, but the interesting thing about remote viewing is the viewers are not supposed to know what the target is. You're supposed to be blind when you start remote viewing up at the front, at the beginning of the session. And so what that means is, and there's a reason for that maybe if we have time I'll explain, but the viewer cannot know what the target is to start with. And so what that means is you're at the mercy of your tasker, right? Whoever it is that's running the show and is directing you at your remote viewing target, you have no idea what they're going to task you on from one session to another. And in that setting, we expected most of our targets were going to be military, intelligence related, governmental, that kind of thing. Well, so we didn't willingly choose to remote view UFO events. We just took whatever the next tasking was that came our way, and that's what we remote viewed. Now, I put Lynn in here because he was like the rest of us, right? We were the stuckies and somebody else was doing the sticking, right? Well, in this case, I put Lynn in here because after everything went public, he came up with several UFO stories that he was the central character in. And so he's gotten a bit of a name of being a UFO-related kind of a person. And it's no accident that he settled in New Mexico, not that far from Roswell. Now, there are some non-Stargate folks in the mix. Oh, sir, yes.
Quick question.
Uh-huh.
Any of these characters have been linked to the film Men Who Stare at Goats?
All of them. Well, not really. I mean, some of those characters, well, all of the characters are composite characters, and you can see bits and pieces of all of these guys in one or another of them, right? Men Who Stare at Goats, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I should have, if I'd known that question was come up, I would have put a series of slides in here that I used at the roast for Hal Putoff on Saturday. I was the one that did the roast, right? So, maybe I'll show you some of that later. I'll tell you what, if we have time, I'll show you excerpts of that, because there's one series of slides that will play that question. You'll get a real kick out of it. Okay. Anyway, you can tell I'm a little more informal about this talk because this is not the one I prepared for, right? So I did prepare, but the one I was worried about was the one that I was going to show to like 2 billionaires, a whole bunch of high-ranking scientists, a bunch of my best friends, you know. That one was the one that I spent hours on. So anyway, especially because of the billionaires. But we won't go there. Okay, so there's some folks who weren't Stargate related. I call them the aftermarket remote viewers that are involved in remote viewing and UFOs. One of them, and perhaps the most notorious one, is Courtney Brown. Okay, I was actually going to put some. Okay, so some of you folks probably know about the Heaven's Gate, the Hale-Bopp comet scandal, right? Courtney Brown was one of the key elements. He's kind of the catalyst for that suicide pact that the Heaven's Gate folks carried out. His professional remote viewers remote viewed an alleged planetary sized companion that was coming with Hale-Bopp comet into the solar system, and his remote viewers. Remember, these are folks he trained after having a 12-day training course, and so it's not surprising that what happened, right? So they remote viewed Hale-Bopp comet and discovered there was this planetary-sized spaceship coming along that was inhabited by aliens who were coming to deliver a message to Earth. And he was on Coast to Coast with Art Bell and told this story and all that stuff. Well, the Heaven's Gate folks, which is this cult of, I guess, sort of quasi-UFO believers, decided that they wanted to get on that spaceship, and the only way to do it, they decided, was to kill themselves. So they committed suicide to get on a spaceship that it turned out was never there. The photos that Courtney Brown was using turned out to be fake. There was no companion body, no anomalous thing. And so they killed themselves to get on a faked photo, essentially, you know. And so the reason I tell you that story, and I won't come back to Courtney probably except indirectly, is because that shows you how remote viewing and UFOs, that linkage can go bad, right? Usually it doesn't go as bad as that, but I'm going to talk more about this later on. Okay, another one that was very much involved with aliens and UFOs and hooked those up with remote viewing is Prudence Calabrese, who was actually a disciple of Courtney Brown's for a while until she went off on her own. And then lately, interestingly, this guy's popped up, Stephen Greer. Now, you probably heard of Greer. Yes. He's now saying he's an expert at remote viewing. He's been remote viewing UFOs, right? So far, I don't know how he became an expert. But at least last I checked, he wasn't. So, you know, I don't want to say he's not. I mean, he could be. I've never talked to him, never met him. But he is an example of someone who's linked remote viewing and UFOs up in the popular culture right now to a great extent. Okay, and these are just kind of samples because there are a lot of folks out there now. The remote viewing became the next big thing about 95, 96 when it was declassified and got on Coast to Coast. And since then, a lot of people have been involved and interested and come on board. Some of them are very responsible in how they approach it. Others are kind of loosey-goosey, you know, and they take liberties with the script, shall we say. Yes, sir.
What about Simeon Hain?
Simeon Hain, yeah. I just actually was with him at a conference in June. So Simeon's a nice guy. He and I would differ considerably about his approach to this stuff. Okay, so before I go further, let me outline my position on UFOs. So again, more audience participation. How many of you in here would say that you are absolutely convinced that UFOs are real in this sense, that UFOs constitute a phenomenon that is intelligently controlled by intelligent entities not of the Earth? Okay, good. Is there anybody here that's skeptical of that claim? There's a few. Okay, good. So my position on this is that I would raise my hand to that first premise too. I'm absolutely convinced that there are that some of these UFO sightings, at least, are of, I'm using these words, but we don't know what they really mean, of vehicles or craft, right, that are controlled by non-earthly alien intelligent entities of some kind, right? Beyond that, I claim total ignorance, right? I am happy to admit that I do have some speculations, but I'm not going to tell anybody that I know the truth on these things, because I don't. I'm absolutely convinced that the basic phenomenon is real, okay? And so anything else I say beyond that is speculation, just to let you know that, okay? I would also say that roughly 95%, and that's just a round number, 95% of what you hear about these in the public domain is just hooey. You know, there's a lot of imagination going on out there. There's a lot of, I don't know, a lot of folks want to say there's disinformation, purposeful disinformation. I'm not sure about that. Except to the extent that there are people out there who take delight in getting people to believe tall stories because they think it's funny, right? And so I think that there are some false UFO kinds of stories that are perpetrated just to make people look stupid, right? So I think that happens as well. So, but I think that a certain percentage of the observations out there are legitimate. Which ones are they? Well, we have to go on to the rules of evidence to decide which ones are most likely to be that way. I don't know which they are. Now, remote viewing as a tool may help us sort this out as long as it's done in the right way. The problem is that so often it hasn't been done in the right way. So let's get into that. All right. So the first guy I'm going to talk about in depth is Pat Price. Pat Price in 1973, and he was one of the, let me add this, Pat Price was one of the most legendary, successful remote viewers in the early days of the remote viewing program. He was a walk-in, essentially. He'd heard about the program, he came in and offered his services. They tried him on a couple of targets, he did really well. And so they started using me as one of their research folks, as one of their lab rats, if you will, right? And he did really well on that. And then when they decided to try and go operational, the CIA actually came in with a project, which I won't go into great detail here, because it's been talked about so much in the literature, but a project on an actual Soviet facility that we didn't know a lot about. And he proceeded to tell them a lot of stuff they knew, but was not public knowledge. There's no way he could have known that information. It was deeply classified. I mean, not just secret or top secret, but code word top secret, which it doesn't get better than that if you're really enamored with secret things, right? And there's no way he could have known that stuff, and yet he reported it accurately. He reported stuff that was only on highly classified satellite photos that the CIA knew. So then he reported stuff they didn't know, and that's what really got their attention, because that stuff actually checked out after the fact. They found out later that he had gotten that accurately. So that really got them going. Ultimately, the CIA and the SRI, when I say SRI, that's Stanford Research Institute, the umbrella government think tank that the program was at, the remote viewing program was at, the CIA hired him away from SRI, and they were really mad because they essentially took their best viewer, right? So they hired him away from SRI, and he ended up working for them until he died, with under a number of interestingly mysterious circumstances later on. There's all this talk that the CIA killed him because he was so good. I think that's wrong. The CIA wanted to use him. They actually were using him. The evidence points to the KGB. And there's a lot of, he told his daughter, and I've talked to her personally about this, he told his daughter 2 weeks before he died that the KGB was going to get him. And he actually did some wills and all kinds of stuff because he figured they were going to succeed. And I won't go into great detail on this, but it's an interesting case. There's a lot of rumor about it that isn't true about the mystery surrounding Pat Price's death, but there are true mysteries surrounding that. Anyway, so one day, he'd like to just go out and do opportunistic remote viewing, just for fun, right? He'd come in, he'd go home at night after working in the lab, and he'd come back the next day and say, well, you know, I got kind of bored, and so I started looking around the world, you know, that kind of a thing. So he, one day he came in to Hal, and he said, Dr. Putoff, I got some stuff to tell you. I was wondering, I started thinking a few days ago about what's going on with all this UFO activity. And so I started looking around for bases around the planet. And so this is not a standard remote viewing protocol, right? He was purposely, in a way, it's what we call front-loaded. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But he did produce some interesting information. He said, I found 4 main bases around the planet. And they're all interestingly in mountains, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. And these were what they were. Mount Hayes, Alaska, Mount Zeal, Australia, Mount Perdido in the Pyrenees, Mount Nyangani in Zimbabwe. Of course, back then he called it Inyangana, which is what its name was back then, in Rhodesia, which is what its name was back then, right? Things have changed in the meantime. These 4 mountains were the main things. And the particular thing he said about Zeal, I'm going to have Hal tell you about that, actually. He'll tell you a little bit of a story here.
You told a story a while back about Pat Price just kind of on his own going out and exploring the world for alien bases, for essentially UFO bases on Earth. Could you tell me that story again?
Okay, let me give a little background on Pat Price. In our CIA and DIA funded program at SRI, looking into remote viewing, Pat Price was for sure one of our best remote viewers. Now, in addition to the taskings that we would give him, which he performed very well on, occasionally he would come in and say he'd just been sort of wandering around the Earth and came up with something, and he reported it to us. Just to give you an idea of how accurate that could be, and something we know the answer to. One day he came in, it was toward the end of Nixon's first term in office as president, and he said, I was looking around and I realized there's something in Nixon's office that will actually prevent him from making it through the second term. So we dutifully reported that back to our CIA handlers. And so they went over to the Oval Office, they looked for microwave devices or toxic substances or whatever, and they didn't find anything. But of course, as we now know from history, what was in his office that kept him from getting through his second term, the device was the tape recorder, tape recording all the Watergate issues. And so that was really obviously very accurate. Interesting enough, when he told us that, we said, oh no, that means that Spyro Agnew will become president, who was then the vice president. And Nixon said, Pat Price said, nope, he goes first. So when you consider the statistical probability of coming up with those 2 statements that turned out to be true, it's just off the chart. So that shows how good he was. Okay, on another day, he came in and said, I was looking around the planet last night, and I found 4 UFO bases. And so I asked him where they were and took down notes and reported them back to our CIA handlers. One of the bases, he claimed, was at Mount Zeal in Australia. So it turns out that my contract monitor called me and said, well, I know the station chief in Australia. Let me call over there and see if I can verify this. So he called the CIA station chief in Australia, and without telling him why he was calling, he just simply said, I'd like to ask you some questions about that area up around Mount Zeal. And the CIA station chief immediately came back, oh, you mean where all the UFOs are always flying around? So we took that as possible confirmation that, in fact, he was right about that. And he named 3 other sites around the planet, one in Alaska, one in Africa, and one on the borderline in the Pyrenees between France and Spain. And later on, other remote viewers were blind targeted on those sites. It also came up with seeming confirmation based on seeing unusual high-tech areas. So anyway, that was our introduction to UFOs through remote viewing.
Hal?
So I'll show you some of that stuff actually that he was talking about. What was interesting, well, here you go. See, here I always say that, what's interesting, because there's so many interesting things. Back when Joe McMoneagle was still fairly mobile, he's got a deteriorating back condition, which really has caused him trouble. He and Skip Atwater decided to go check out the Pyrenees mountainside, and they hiked up there and hiked around. They didn't report seeing anything unusual or finding anything unusual, but they thought they'd at least see if they could. Right? The interesting thing, it's such a bad habit, such a bad habit. In conjunction with that, reading Pat Price's reports, he talks about there being all kinds of sensors around these bases, and talks about what kinds of sensors they are and stuff. So no one could actually get there, if they're real, right? No one could actually get there without alerting the inhabitants of the bases that they were being approached. So who knows? Who knows? All right, so an example of one of the some of the results that Pat Price produced was, this is one of the vessels, or whatever you want to call them. He did a sketch of this. It says about 120 feet by about 40 feet. Talks about the skin, it's layered, and what its functions and stuff are. And he talks about some stuff inside. This was a device that was inside of it. This was a model of the solar system when he was talking about where the different, I think this is our source. Count the rings, make sure there's 9 there, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yes, that's our solar system. Okay. He talked about, when he was talking about which of them were, he said that they were controlled out of a base on Mars. So, and all of that sounds pretty fantastic, and I am not going to jump on board and say he had it right. I don't know. But it was very interesting. So some of this material I talked about in a couple of issues of UFO magazine, which is now, I believe, defunct. I don't think it's published anymore, is it? I got to be friends with the editor, Bill Burns, but I think it's gone now.
I thought they still had it.
Well, maybe it is. It could be. Maybe it's just online. It could be. I used to get it every month in my box. I didn't subscribe to it because I wrote the articles. They put me on the mailing list, so that was cool. But in one of these articles, I talk about Grill Flame Project 8024. Now, this is the only official UFO-related target that was ever worked in the remote viewing program. You hear lots of stories about.
Were those the coordinates? 8024.
No, that was the project number. It was 80 was 1980, and 24 is the 24th project that we worked. Good catch. I'll tell you what it was in a second, but so there are a lot of there's a lot of stories about projects we worked at Fort Meade, and we did work actually quite a few UFO targets at Fort Meade in the remote viewing program, but all of those were unofficial. In fact, if our higher ups knew we were doing them, it would have gotten very upset. In fact, they did get upset a couple times, not at the viewers, because remember, we're like mushrooms, we're in the dark and eating crap, so it wasn't our fault. But at Dames got chewed out on a regular basis. Dames got chewed out because he would run us on these targets, right? In a way, I'm glad he did, although he didn't always do it right. Oftentimes, in theory, if you're going to do a project like this, you want to be double-blind if you can, because the interviewer's own predispositions to believe can affect what the viewer produces, right? He was never blind on the project, but sometimes he did it in a way that the viewer didn't realize it was a UFO thing until he got really into it. So some of them are interesting. So in a way, I'm glad he did, because it did at least show that. But it also, oftentimes they get given too much credence, because we don't know really how accurate they really are, right? So this particular project, though, was done as an official project, was not Ed Dames, it was Skip Atwater. As far as I know, this was double blind. I don't have all the full details on the surroundings of it. But the target was an object in a photo. It was not this object. Or this photo. Yeah. This is just to show you what a spy satellite looks like, right? There's an electro-optic imagery satellite. I don't even know if it's an actually American intelligence satellite. It could be, like what's the French spot? There's a bunch of them up there now. But one of our is KH-11, as I recall, satellite was orbiting over, and it got the image of something going under it. And if you think about that, that's really kind of weird because, you know, they're up there, I don't know, let's see. I don't know how high up there. Does anybody know how high KH-11 is with orbit?
Whether they're in the, what's it, orbit?
Stratus?
They're not in a geostationary orbit.
We're not-
No. They're a lot closer than that because they can be moved around and their orbits can be shifted, right? Anyway, it was maybe, well, let's say 400 miles up, something like that, right? And something passed under it, but outside of the atmosphere. And it wasn't space junk. They didn't know what it was. And so they couldn't get any other info on it, so they asked the remote viewing program to remote view this. And 2 viewers worked on it. And this is what came of it. What is back here I keep tripping on?
Excuse me, what was the year of this?
This was 1980. Yeah. So did they have KH-11s then? I think they did. I don't remember. It might have been a predecessor to it. But one of the viewers produced an accurate description of ITAC, the Intelligence Threat and Analysis Command, right? Those are the folks that ask us to remote view this. It's their job to try and find out where the threats are, right? and one of the viewers actually described their headquarters building really accurately. You know, they were impressed by that, but it didn't do them any good. And that same viewer described a helicopter with a funny hull shape. It didn't look like any helicopter he'd ever seen, right? So this is probably a thing going on. 2 things are going on with that. There's a thing called an analytical overlay in remote viewing, which is where your left brain starts making things up based on the data that's perceived. That just a certain amount of data gets in, it's not enough for the left brain to come up with an answer, and so its job is to interpret, so it'll make anything up to try and fit the data. And so it may have perceived a space vehicle, not recognize it was a space vehicle. The left brain said, well, what is this? Well, the only thing I can think of is a helicopter, but then drew it in a very funny way that didn't look like your typical helicopter, right? So there's probably some analytical overlay going on there. And then the fact they described the ITAC building was that one of them, the same viewer, probably homed in on the guy who was asking them to remote view it, right? So that information is probably not very useful. But the other guy talked about an object in free fall in space orbit. And he drew this sketch. Okay. Now you look at that and it looks a little bit like a rocket ship, but I'm not sure. Because notice the fins aren't completed down here if those are fins. I mean, you could think of it as going the other way, right? Being some. Now you do have, of course, in this photo of the. Nope, that's too far. The satellite. Now it really doesn't look that much like it, I guess. So you know, you think maybe it was remote viewing a satellite, but I don't know what it was. But whatever it was, this viewer seems to have homed in on the actual intended target. And unfortunately, he didn't provide any more information from it. And that shows you one of the problems with remote viewing is you get what you get. And sometimes it isn't very detailed.
They say purple one.
See, they see lights. on
Purple, black. Purple, black. I think he was referring to the background here, right? Okay. And then lights are spherical objects, okay, which are undoubtedly the stars or whatever, you know, the black and the stars. We saw this thing against the back, a dark purple, a black, purple black background with little round things.
Now you
Okay.
said he
could
may have
be a
been
fleet.
front loaded.
No,
Did
they
he
weren't
just
in
have
this
a number?
case. Yeah, in this case they would have just gone by some kind of
Number.
neutral targeting. So
Pretty okay.
it's
yeah.
pretty interesting. Sir.
Who were the viewers on that?
I don't know. This does not look like Joe McMonagle's work. In this particular session, they didn't actually list they listed the viewers by number, and I didn't recognize the numbers. Or if I did, it's been so long I can't remember who it was.
So the lit up spherical object.
Well,
It could be a fleet.
it could be a fleet, or it
Or
just could.
escort.
Or it could be just perception of stars. You know, the satellite would have picked that stuff up, given its advantage, if there was more than one of these things out there. So,
But this, he's seeing the stars below.
yeah, that's a little
Below the-
interesting, isn't it? Yeah,
I mean, is he looking up at it or is he looking down at it?
or both.
Or, yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing about remote viewing is your perspective can move around too. Yeah, sir.
Speaking of satellites, has anyone done remote viewing on the Black Knight?
Blacklight.
Black Knight.
Black Knight.
Oh, Black Knight. I think some folks have just for fun. I don't know of any official work that's been done on it. Yeah, that's right. That's a satellite. Nobody knows what it is, but it looks like a Black Knight, doesn't it? Yeah. And I don't know. I know that it's been posted as a possible target for folks on the internet. So somebody may well have done it. Haven't seen any results from it. So, okay. Well, I'm going to tell you about a session that Mel Riley did. So another query for the UFO experts out here. Can somebody give me an outline of the Higdon experience?
What?
Higdon experience? Anybody know that one? Oh, okay. That happened back in the mid-70s, I think 74. And I'll tell you what I can remember.
Would you repeat the word?
Higdon. Higdon experience. It happened in Montana.
Yeah.
There was a guy out hunting elk, and he was about to shoot an elk, and he fired his rifle, and the bullet... I'm sorry, did you have a question? Oh, no, I guess not. He fired his rifle, and the bullet apparently went out real slow and just like that, right? And he thought that was weird. I must have had my reloading formula wrong on that one. Anyway, and then he realizes nearby is a humanoid shape that was very tall, and I don't remember the full description of it. And the humanoid essentially communicated with him in a nonverbal way. And like for one thing, he offered him a pill to eat because he thought he was hungry. He was hunting the elk, therefore he must be hungry, or something like that. And at some point, he reports that the alien then enclosed him in this ball of some kind of energy, along with 5 of the elk that were in the herd that he was stalking. And then informed me that they were going to go to a planet far away. And they went very quickly to that planet, and he gets there, and he reports he's in this kind of urban kind of area with towers and all kinds of strange buildings up, one of which looked very much like the Seattle Space Needle, or at least reminded him of that. And then at some point he gets back, the alien brings him back and drops him off, and it's about 2.5 hours later, and the elk are long gone or never came back. Maybe they liked it better there, I don't know. And he can't get his truck going because it's stuck in the mud, and the people show up to help him, and they say he was very disoriented and kind of frantic in a way. Okay, so anyway, that was the Higdon experience. And what's the truth value of it? I don't know. It's interesting, but this session is interesting. I'll show you the full session later, but this is maybe I'll show it to you now. Let me think about that. But here's parts of it. So this is what Mel sketched. And he talked about this humanoid kind of a person, very pale complexion, no hair or eyebrows. Most prominent feature is a straight, narrow, sharp nose. And as I recall, that kind of matches the description of the guy who the alien that this guy saw. Oh, I didn't finish the story. The guy's main complaint when they came to help him get unstuck was that they had stolen his elk. So anyway, maybe let me change out here for a second. I'm going to show you the whole session, just so you can see what it looks like.
The guy's name was Mel Riley.
Yeah.
That had that experience.
Yeah, he's quite well known in remote viewing circles.
Mel Riley is the viewer or the experiencer?
Mel Riley was the viewer.
The viewer.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Hope there's nothing revealing on here.
I was going to say, that would be wonderful to have all of that.
Yeah.
Just a lot of redacted files.
Too fast.
There's so many secrets and so little time. Oh, there we go. Okay. Excellent. All right. So he starts with, I'm not going to go through all of these details, right, how this works, but I got to invite him up here to be my techie. He knows how to do this.
I'm in the IT industry.
Ah, there you go. Okay. So here you see the view you just saw curving around. Now he doesn't.
What was that? Was that some bubble that the bullet just hit and went?
This thing right here.
Yeah.
Well, it's possible. It's portion of a flying saucer of some kind, right? So you can see if you continue it around like this. See,
Okay.
you might have that. And don't know what these stairs are, except maybe they were the access way into it. If he's remote viewing something real, and I'll explain later why we can't necessarily assume that he's remote viewing something real here. Then he starts. He's got a lot of information about this. Goes to talk about a city, right? And lots of different elements about this city. And then he draws that. Now remember, the guy in the Higdon experience reported a space needle-like structure. Okay, and he even says it's like the Seattle Needle. And then he sketched that. So let's see, what else is there? That's it. That's the opening. Okay, so he did this session on the 10th of March, 1987. Ed Dames was his monitor, and he's. Now the interesting thing here is Ed supposedly stayed completely quiet while the session was going on. So this Class B means here, right, is that he gave no verbalization at all during the course of this thing. So I suspect that's mostly true. Okay, mostly true. Which is what makes this fairly remarkable, is because one of the worries about remote viewing, if the monitor knows what the target is, that there'll be some kind of nonverbal communication to the viewer, and that will distort the data. But I would argue that no amount of nonverbal communication can communicate enough information to do a sketch like that. So, however good or bad Ed was in that session, the similarities to what's coming out in this to the actual Higdon experience are really quite interesting. There's a lot of intriguing parallels that are a little bit tough to explain in your normal way. Now, I will come back to this and explain what some of our concerns ought to be. All right, so that's from the Higdon experience. This is another one which was just referred to as a possible CE3 event, CE meaning close encounters of the third kind event, right? Which brings us back to another interesting connection to remote viewing. So I talked about Jacques Vallée. How many here have seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind? Yeah. So there's a ufologist, a UFO specialist in there who's French, right? Played by, Francois Truffaut, yeah. That was modeled on Jacques Vallée, because Jacques Vallée is considered one of the more responsible of the ufologists, because he approaches the phenomenon in a fairly objective way and doesn't jump to logical conclusions, logical leaps, that kind of thing. And the interesting thing about that was because at the time the film was being made, well, of course, if you remember in it, you've got Richard Dreyfuss building Devil's Tower out of mashed potatoes on his dining room table, right? That's stage 6, controlled remote viewing.
Yeah.
You build an actual three-dimensional model in stage 6 of CRV. And it was the same time that Jacques Vallée was being an advisor to the remote viewing program. So I don't know to what role Jacques Vallée had an interaction there. He says it wasn't much. But he was dealing with a classified program, so we hope he wasn't telling secrets to the producer Spielberg, right? But who knows? In any case, there's a very similar thing going on in that movie to remote viewing, and the model for the character in it was Jacques Vallée. So there's a crosswalk there of some kind. Okay. All right. So this was the Close Encounter of the Third Kind. There's more to this session, which I don't have this session on my computer, but just to show you some of the things they came up with. Here's another one, kind of showing a possible spaceship. This is in one of the bases, actually, which I am actually about to talk about. Yes, that's right. This might be a little bit out of order because it has to do with this. Mount Hayes, Alaska base. Remember Hal in his little interview said a few minutes ago that some of the viewers were actually targeted on Pat Price's bases, and when Skip Atwater did it was fully blind. It was really well controlled, and these were Skip Atwater task sessions, right? So if they were tasked on it, they seemed to come up with corroborating information. Well, this was Mel Riley's session about it. This was part of Mel Riley's session about it, and in Pat's, let's see, these are all jumbled up. Sorry about that. I'll try and keep them straight for you. You notice you've got this chamber in here and a tunnel, and it comes out here, right? So Pat, when he described it, said that there is a cavern-like opening in the mountain, in Mount Hayes, at about the, I think he said about the 12,000 foot level, and that there's a little landing platform that extends out. These little craft come in and land on it, and then it pulls them back inside the mountain. And as you go back inside, there's chambers and stuff where they work on things like that, right? So this was what Mel came up with, and he was tasked by Skip Atwater on this. And it was this, possible UFO base. Now, here's one of mine. I produced this particular session. This is one page out of it, and I described there were a bunch of these things. And they look like this from the side, and they look like this from the top, okay? I call it like a torus, or for a fusion generator. It was shielded, but the odd thing about it is it seemed to be kind of hovering. It wasn't on the ground. I remember doing this session. That was the impression I got. I didn't know this was a UFO target. I had no idea, right? And so there's this one, and then let's go back to that drawing that Pat Price made of a object in this mountain. And these were separated by 14, let's see, I did this in 80, I don't remember what year I did it, 80, in the mid-80s, and Pat did his in the early 70s. So we're separated by at least, 12, 15 years, something like that, right? And yet there's interesting consistencies between the results that were produced. The way Pat's got this, so this is a cross-section. I should have brought a laser with me. This is a cross-section as if you're looking at it from this direction, right? And then he's drawn this to kind of show what if you were looking at it from the top. That's where these distances and stuff come from, right? So kind of like I did. I had never seen this session before. I had never seen that. I didn't even know Pat Price had done this at the time I did this work. And yet we have this very interesting correlation in the sketches that come out of it. So, all right. Now here's another one of Mel's of this mountain thing. Okay, so you see the tunnel, right? Some kind of glowing dome right overhead. And then he has this as the opening of it. And then this was part of it as well. I think this was part of the session, which he was talking about an alien that was working on a kind of a keyboard thing, right? So I don't know. I mean, this looks more like a piano, so maybe this is the rock band in Star Wars. I don't know. But he says like keys or switches or whatever. Say the bar scene, yeah. So it's also possible, I mean, it's possible that that's actually how, if this thing is real, that they were actually controlling things. Or it's possible that his right brain said keyboard and his left brain interpreted as a piano, right? We won't know that. Even Mel wouldn't know that today. But there's a couple of interesting ambiguities and possibilities here, okay? So those are just some examples of the kinds of things that remote viewing has produced with UFOs, in remote viewing UFOs. So let's talk about the advantages of remote viewing UFO targets. So this is kind of an audience participation thing here too. What do you think the upside of using remote viewing to remote view UFOs, ETs, anything like this, what do you think the upside of it could be?
Technology.
Okay, so fill that out a little more.
Possible beginnings of, more technology, better technology.
Oh, so it could be used to get more new technology, to go out and essentially, in a way, doing what we did with the military, spying on the Soviets. This time we'd be spying on extraterrestrials to see if we could steal some of their technology, essentially. Is that what you're saying? Okay, so yeah, I mean, that's one use it could be put to.
In a way, it's a control issue because most of the stories about UFOs are witness stories, and you don't have any controls at all.
Yes.
And so with something that you don't have any information or any way of deliberately going out and getting information for, this is really, sounds like the only way you can say, I want to learn more about this.
Okay, so you're talking about as an alternative channel to get information to maybe confirm or disconfirm UFO eyewitness reports.
Or find out anything on your own. It's a control, you're in control of that.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah, okay, yeah. So my misunderstanding of what you were saying actually led me to remember something I was going to say. So that's good, right? And that is, It actually can be useful for verifying if a UFO event occurred, at least adding verification to it, or for disconfirming a UFO event. And we actually used it for that purpose. So there was an event in the Midwest in, I want to say, the 50s or early 60s maybe. In Illinois, a F-89 fighter jet went down and disappeared, and there was some weird radar anomalies and stuff, and over the years, the family, the pilot's absolutely convinced it was a UFO encounter, and a lot of other people have been convinced it's a UFO encounter. And so in 1999 actually, Skip Atwater was asked to see if he could use remote viewing to find out what actually happened. And so I got tasked on it, as did another remote viewer, and we developed information actually was consistent with the plane going down into a lake caused by a bird strike. So we disconfirmed a UFO event. Okay. Now that doesn't mean you're going to, I think we have actually confirmed, or at least added confirmation to some actual UFO events. But we're also able to eliminate some things in the UFO event as well. Now, we don't have ground truth on it. They still haven't found the plane to verify it. If it's in the bottom of that lake, they're probably not ever going to find it, right? But you can see that it has actually a more of an objective use. A lot of people use it out there, and they find what they're looking for, right? They have an expectation that remote viewing is going to reveal that they're absolutely right about this UFO event, and miracle of miracles, the way they do it, it does confirm their beliefs about it, because they don't do it right. Okay, so I'm going to, well, so first of all, any more advantages you can think of using remote viewing? Yes?
Invite them to come.
Okay, so that would be more like remote communications, right? and of course, we assume we want to invite them. I think there may be some we don't want, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Well, there are 4 bases that have been located, so we can go over there and hunt them.
We could go hunt them. Yeah, and we, are you talking in terms of having a season on aliens? Is that what you're talking about, or not? Yeah. Yeah, we could go search for them if we know. Of course, those are big areas. In spite of the fact that it's narrowed down to a specific mountain, there's a lot of terrain to search. But if we got serious about it and mounted a major effort, maybe we'd actually verify they existed. Right, it's possible. So you're saying, but so remote viewing in that case serves as a tip-off in this case to direct real assets at something like that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Target a satellite on it. Well, although remember, if these are in the mountains, a satellite may not pick them up. A reconnaissance satellite may not be able to observe the location. So anyway, go ahead.
There's a sort of a legend that UFO occupants have telepathic abilities. My question is, have any of the remote viewers that you have known been blocked by some telepathic thing from
for the microphone, there's rumors that aliens have telepathic powers, and have remote viewers been blocked by aliens from observing? And the answer to that is I have no idea. And I don't know how you could know that even. If you're blocked, you just don't get anything, right? And so, I don't know. Yes, sir.
I guess it would allow you to find out if it's a real bona fide UFO target or a terrestrially based target. Yeah,
so remote viewing might be able, that kind of goes back to the earlier discussion. Yeah, remote viewing may allow you to discriminate whether it's a real phenomenon, aerial, unidentified aerial phenomenon, as Jacques Vallée likes to call it, or if it's something much more common and down to earth, so to speak, right? Okay, so let's talk about what can go wrong. Oops. Whew, I'm glad we don't have a mess to clean up, dog. I scared him.
Startled him with your okay.
Yeah. Okay, so quickly I'm going to talk about front-loading telepathic overlay and establishing ground truth. So let's start with the first thing. All right, so the target may not exist, and often there's no way to know. There are plenty of UFO events, I am convinced, that are completely people's imagination. There was no UFO event, but they believe it was. They saw something and then they confabulated it, and it was something more, more common, a normal kind of a thing, but they saw it in a different kind of a way. They maybe have been on some kind of hallucinatory state or whatever, and they end up coming up with this UFO story about a UFO event that never really happened. Okay, so the problem with that, when you're remote viewing, is a thing called telepathic overlay. right? So what telepathic overlay does is if you, in this case, if you're a remote viewer and you get someone who wants to task you with a remote viewing event, and they give you the way we do is we use an arbitrary number, and the one I always use an example is 8675309, right? Some of you will get that. Yeah. 8675309 stands for describe the Higdon event, right, for example, or some of the other more notorious UFO things. Okay, let's pick one though that actually, let's not use that one because that one may or may not have happened. Let's pick one that didn't happen. We'll say the Austin event, right? So remote view the Austin UFO event, okay? And it's weird enough that it could happen, I guess. But anyway, but there's no such event. South Austin, yes, gotcha, yeah. So, and there's no such event, it never happened. Well, but the guy who's doing the tasking, or girl, because this is multi-gender here possible, whoever does the tasking has this really strong belief that it happened. And so when the remote viewer goes out there, they're subconscious, the subconscious does all the work. The subconscious goes out there, sees nothing, finds nothing out there. So then the expectation is there's something. They wouldn't have given me a tasking if there wasn't something. And so the subconscious goes around and finds the next most powerful psychic signal, which is the beliefs of the tasker. And so the viewer starts recording all this information, provides to the tasker. It's exactly the scenario the tasker believes. You essentially have confirmed their beliefs about this thing. Well, I believed it. If the remote viewer reports that information, then it must be true, right? Not necessarily. It could be telepathic overlay. You're being psychic in that setting. You're just being psychic in the wrong way, okay? And I think a lot of the results of people remote viewing these kind of targets are the information as a result of telepathic overlay. Did you have a question? Oh, okay, that's right, good. I'm always alert for waving hands, so yeah. No, that's okay, now I know you can wave it all you want, right? Yeah, so I think that's the case with the Courtney Brown thing and the Hale-Bopp comet and the Heaven's Gate suicide, is that there was a strong belief about that, and it leaked into what the viewers were reporting, and so they confirmed that belief, and they confirmed essentially imagination. And unfortunately, it had more tragic consequences than usually is the case, right? Now, I'm not saying those folks wouldn't have done it anyway without Courtney Brown's claims, but who knows, you know. Okay, so that's one problem, is telepathic overlay. If you're remote viewing something that didn't happen, you could get really good information about it and it'd be completely wrong.
That kind of telepathic overlay happens a lot in psychic readings too, where the
yes.
psychic is not telling you your present or your future, they're reading your mind.
Yeah, and that happens in a lot of other remote viewing environments as well. So yes, that's a good point. Thank you. All right. So, whoops, how did we get to 3 already? Okay, well either number 2 is missing or it never existed. So number 3, okay. The accuracy of the session is more vulnerable. Accuracy of the session is more vulnerable than many other settings, remote viewing settings, to faulty protocols, well, than in other remote viewing sessions. Let me read that again. The accuracy of the session is more vulnerable to faulty protocols than in other remote viewing situations. What does that mean? Front loading. Okay, so the problem here is, oftentimes in these UFO targetings, particularly in the case of a tasker that really doesn't understand remote viewing, they are so eager to tell the remote viewer what it is they want them to remote view that they will tell them what they want them to remote view. Okay, and that's called front loading, where the viewer knows up front what they're doing. There are some practitioners out there who swear you can remote view front loaded and be perfectly good. I would say that's total balderdash. If you know what the target is, you're going to have serious problems remote viewing it correctly, because everything you know about it, everything you can guess about it, everything you can speculate about it is going to be right there in your head while you're trying to remote view ground truth. And that is going to cloud any information that may come in through the psychic channel, the ESP channel, whatever you want to call it. And so being front loaded can really mess up a session. Now that'll happen in a normal kind of remote viewing session. In a training session, you might give somebody a target, the Eiffel Tower, and they want you to remote view the Eiffel Tower. Well, if you tell the viewer even things such as it's a monument, I want you to describe the monument, all of that stuff is going to be right in there, and they're going to end up messing up the session. In remote viewing, where imagination can go anywhere with this, in UFOs, where imagination can go anywhere with this, you end up with really a real mess sometimes if you're not following the protocol carefully. Okay. All right. The tasker and other non-viewers associated with the remote viewing effort must be very careful. The tasker and other non-viewers associated with the remote viewing effort must be very careful because assumptions can be deadly, right? I've already illustrated one way that is. The tasker assumes that there was an event when there wasn't. You can get this telepathic overlay thing. But it becomes particularly the problem in this here I'm talking about not just tasking, but also analysis of the resulting data, trying to figure out what it means. If you have somebody who already has an opinion about what this target is, they will oftentimes weight some of the information the viewer produces more heavily and discount the other information to try and twist the information around, even unintentionally. Sometimes they don't do it on purpose, but it's still there, right? To twist it around to where it tells the story they want it to tell. We see that happen a lot out there in the remote viewing public, in the world, and associated with this kind of stuff oftentimes. Okay? And unless ground truth is obtained, results should always be treated as tentative or speculative, never as being certain. Essentially, until you get some kind of actual confirmatory evidence from another source, and this is not something just for remote viewing, this applies to almost anything in life, right? Particularly intelligence work, particularly in any kind of analytic processing, you need to have confirmation about whatever it is that you have information on to make sure what you've got is real, right? So unless you can get a ground truth, you have to always treat remote viewing data as if the jury is still out. It's interesting, it's provocative, it may be true, but until you have something that confirms it, you can't assume that the picture you've got is the correct picture. And yet there are people who will make decisions based on an uncorroborated remote viewing session, particularly in this realm of anomalies and such. Okay. So I already showed you one of these session examples. I don't think I'm going to show you another one. We're over quite a bit. But one thing I do want to tell you about, I do have copies of my book, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, here. If you're interested, well, they'll be available afterwards. They're $18.
Highly recommended.
Who said that? You said that? Yeah. Okay. Also interesting, and I have some flyers for this. I'll have to get them out. If you at all have the possibility of going to New Orleans on the weekend of 23 to 25 September, we are hosting, the International Remote Viewing Association is hosting the 2016 Remote Viewing Conference. And we have some awesome speakers, talks, and workshops going on. The very first thing on Friday morning, I'm doing a 90-minute workshop, Introduction to Remote Viewing, where I give some background on it, and then I actually give folks a chance to try it after I give them some basic instruction. Now, I'm not turning you into a great remote viewer in this setting. It's only 90 minutes worth, right? But if you haven't done it before, it's a great opportunity to just get your feet wet and make a stab at it. But the conference is this time. If you're interested in going, get a hold of me and I can tell you how to get a $50 discount from the price. Okay? So, and I do have some flyers. I'll hand them to you if you're interested. All right. So what are your questions concerning what I've talked about so far?
Morehouse, I'm sorry.
Oh, I left him out of this. I forgot Morehouse. Well, okay.
I think I remember him talk about that in class.
He did a little bit of what Dave did. Now, Dave was only in the program for 2 years. So he actually was the shortest time period in the program of any of the remote viewers. So he really didn't have much time to work any of these anomaly things. And Dames left pretty soon after he got there. So we didn't do a lot of UFO tasking after Dave got there. He did some with Dames while they overlapped, but yeah. Okay, ma'am.
So I have two questions. The bases in the mountains that were remote view, is that is part of the view that those bases are not man-made, but
right.
Okay.
Well, yeah, artificial, but not made by humans.
Yes.
Right,
Okay.
and if you read some of the
So there's no conspiracy.
no conspiracy, no. These are meant. Allegedly, these are alien type bases, right? And all of the transcripts that are directed at these the remote viewing sessions talk about them being not necessarily human. The one I did, which was kind of surprising to me because I wasn't expecting to get any kind of a UFO kind of thing, right? And I'm talking about these guys don't seem to be humans, which is really kind of weird, right? What do you do with that? So, yeah.
Okay, and my second question.
Oh, okay.
Did the government go about looking for people who had this talent, if you will, or did they already have the process and train people to do it?
Both. The first batch of folks, they looked for, actually they didn't know what indicators of the talent were. And we still don't, right? We know the attitudes people have to be successful, but we don't necessarily know the qualities. There are some, it depends on which researcher you're talking about. Some people think extroversion is an indicator of ability. Some think introversion is. Some think other different continua personality types. But there's nothing really hard and fast about who's good at it and who isn't. You just got to try it and find out. So what they did first was they screened the intelligence community in the DC area for people who had some kind of unusual experience or whatever, or they brought a lot of folks in and had them answer questionnaires, and they'd ask a few questions about ESP, and depending on how they answered that, then they would question them a little bit further. When they got their smaller, narrowed down, they started with I think 2,000 people and got it down to about 50, and then they would actually show them articles about ESP and have them rank how they felt about it on the thing, and then also write if they had any unusual experiences and stuff in the queries. And from that, they distilled it down to 12 folks, and then 6 of them were assignable. They could be assigned full-time to the program. 6 others couldn't be, but they were brought on as part-timers. And so that's how they got down to it, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
There are there's probably way more than 2, but 2 areas that just pop out in my mind of having lots of UFO sightings, Mount Shasta and in Sacred Valley of Peru. I was surprised not to see either of them on that list. Any thoughts about just portals and entry areas?
So, anytime you label something as a portal or an entry area, you're in the speculation mode, right? Because we don't really know what's going on there. It's one way of explaining what might be going on. And I'm not saying that's not true, right? I'm just saying we don't know whether it really is a portal or not. But there are these certain phenomena we're observing, and one way of explaining it might be something along those lines, okay? I wouldn't be surprised if somebody out there who has gotten involved in remote viewing has remote viewed every one of these kinds of things. Because there are literally thousands of people who have studied remote viewing now, and they're always looking for something new and exciting to do. So it's quite possible. But there's no central place to publish results like that. And so I don't know of anybody who's remote viewed those kinds of things, right? So.
What about Middle Earth?
Well, you mean the one with the hobbits, or?
Has anybody ever remote viewed into Middle Earth?
Well, I'm not sure what Middle Earth means here. I'm familiar with Tolkien's novels, right? And are you talking about
There's a lot of testimony about
The aliens are.
Yeah, there's a lot of testimony about.
Yes, I think people have remote viewed that. I can't tell you what.
Or you'd have to kill them, right?
No, I have to tell you I'm kind of skeptical, sir. Is this a question or is this an admin thing?
It's a question.
Okay, but let me finish. I have to say I'm skeptical, right? And I'll be honest with you, things that I believe and things I don't believe, right? It doesn't mean that you're wrong, right? It just means that I'm doubtful, right? And I have been known to change my mind in the past, right? When I found out there was substance to some claims that I was skeptical of. This one, I haven't had my mind changed yet. Maybe I will. I don't know. Okay. Yes.
So there's a gray area between all of this,
and
it's.
Wait a minute. Did you use that word on purpose? A gray area. Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Let's talk about Area 51.
Okay.
And all the talk about the reverse engineering from stuff. What's all that about?
What's this all about? Well, If there was a place that stuff was going on, it would be Area 51, or at least once was. I think that a lot of the functionality of that place has been moved just because it's become so notorious, right? Are we reverse engineering stuff is probably closer to the question you have, right? And my answer is, heck if I know, and I don't rule that out at all. I think it is within the realm of possibility that we do have some alien artifacts and maybe even an alien spaceship that we're working on. Are we doing it? I wouldn't stake my life on it. Are we not doing it? I wouldn't stake my life on that either, right? I do not know. And I certainly know that there's a lot more conventional stuff going on at Area 51. I mean, it was built not for UFOs. It was definitely built for skunk works kind of stuff, so they could test what was then unconventional aircraft in an environment where it was a lot harder for people we didn't want to see that stuff to see it, right? So certainly there's certainly real legitimate standard research going on there. Is there this other thing going on there involving UFOs? Maybe, I don't know. And I don't know anybody who actually does. Bob Lazar, I don't necessarily trust him, for example. The stuff I've read is not convincing me. But, well, let me put it this way. There are people who know, but they aren't talking. Right? Okay. Yes, yeah.
Have there been any remote viewings that you know of related to living alien beings, you know, kept by our government?
Again, I don't know of any that were ever done in conjunction with the remote viewing program. Have other people done it? Maybe.
Yeah.
And is it real? I don't know. I mean, they could be remote viewing something that doesn't exist and be getting telepathic overlay.
If you don't know,
yeah.
if you don't know who did it and how they did it, you don't know what the results mean.
But the one thing we do know is that if they are working on living alien humans, they won't be living. I mean, alien humans? Well, it could be alien humans, right? Yeah, yeah. If they're working on living alien beings, at some point they won't be living anymore. Just by nature, even those guys aren't immortal, I presume. You know. So anyway, okay, good question.
So, how do we know for sure that the remote viewing has been disbanded and we're not doing that anymore?
We don't know that for sure. When people ask, well, is the program still going on, but just hidden somewhere deep in Langley or something like that? My answer is, I'm pretty convinced it did end, right? Well, I know the Stargate program did end, and I'm pretty convinced that it stayed ended. It has, I say roughly 90% chance that the government is not doing it anymore. Notice I leave 10% chance it is, right? But knowing why it was canceled, knowing who was involved in canceling it, it was a very uncomfortable fit in the intelligence community. You had a bunch of people who were in favor of it, who were forward thinkers and thought we really need to do this. You had a bunch of other folks who were adamantly opposed to it. They were skeptics. They didn't believe in it. In fact, there's one official that was famously quoted as saying, "This is the kind of thing I wouldn't believe even if it was true." Right? And that is the attitude, and was the attitude of a lot of... No. Interestingly, I think Rumsfeld might be in favor of some of this stuff. But the thing is, those kind of folks are the wrong kind of folks to even entertain the idea of remote viewing. And when the program was canceled in '95, the director of CIA, which is where the Congress tried to pass this from the Defense Intelligence Agency to the Central Intelligence Agency, the director of the CIA was notorious for being a remote viewing skeptic. Dale Graff, who is one of the longest serving folks in the program, was set to brief him on the remote viewing program when that director, is Deutsch, John Deutsch, I think, when Deutsch found out what the subject of the briefing was, he kicked Dale out of his office and told him not to come back. He just had a totally closed mind about it. And you ran into a lot of those kind of folks in that bureaucracy and in all of the services who kept trying to kill it, and proponents would bring it back, right? The problem was, well, the problem was, no, they just did, trust me, I've talked to some of these guys. They did not want it, absolutely, because they rejected the possibility. You see it in today's society all over the place, right? You get all kinds of people who reject the idea that this could even work at all, right? And those guys tend to do well in a bureaucracy because they're butt coverers essentially, right? You know, they don't want to take risks, right? And so that was kind of partly the case here. So, but there is a slim chance, and I have a suspicion maybe NSA is doing it, but I can't prove it. As Lynn Buchanan says, he says, if there was a secret program going on, I knew about it, I'd have to say I can't tell you. If there was a secret program going on and I didn't know about it, I'd have to say I can't tell you. So I'm just going to say I can't tell you. You had a question?
Yes. You know, this is a remote viewing is a collecting of information, but I studied some of this stuff, and you can also send people thoughts. So you can, you know, like start thinking about having chicken soup, and pretty soon they'll say they want chicken soup.
That would be called remote influencing.
Well,
that's a specific discipline called remote influencing.
These people that don't want to do this, just send them a bunch of.
Oh right, yeah,
you know,
yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. Kind of like what do they call it? Manifesting, right?
Yes.
Manifesting, yeah. Okay.
So were they able in that movie truly to make the goats follow her?
That never happened.
Okay.
That never
because
happened.
I know you can influence, but I didn't.
Yeah.
I've never heard of anybody really making somebody pass.
Yeah, the whole goat story was fabricated by somebody who told tall tales. In the movie, the real Colonel or the one in the movie? Oh yeah, Jim Channon.
Jim Channon.
Yeah. Now that Channon, Channon. So in the movie, of course, Bridges played what's his name? Jeff Bridges played a Jim Channon-esque role, right? First of all, Channon, interestingly, never had anything to do with the remote viewing program. He had nothing to do with it in his entire career, and he was never in charge of anything. I take that back. I think he was what did he do? An infantry company commander in Vietnam, something like that. But he was a futurist, kind of an army futurist, right? And he did a lot of research and stuff. He wasn't any kind of a unit commander, right? Later on in his career. So there are a lot of things that movie misportrayed for the sake of the story, right? And all of the viewers in there are modeled on a kind of basket of other actual remote viewers. There's the one guy, he kind of had, you know, he had hair and glasses, and he was in The Office. The actor played one of the guys in the Office series, but he's a remote viewer in this, and he's getting married in the movie, right? And so the Kevin Spacey character comes up and says, "Congratulations on getting married. Too bad it doesn't last," right? But that character, I was the only male ever to get married in the remote viewing while I was in the remote viewing unit, and I looked at that time quite a bit like this character. So I have my suspicions that maybe that's where that character came from.
Does that happen?
No, actually, I'm still married to her. It was the one before that didn't work. Yeah. But yeah, so it was interesting. There's a lot of stuff in the Men Who Stare at Goats movies just completely wrong or distorted on purpose to make the story interesting. A lot of link-ups, hookups, like the PSYOPs, the psychological operations. We had no crosswalk with them. We had no connection with them at all. Yet in the movie, it makes it look like it's all linked up. Right. So anyway, there is another question, I think.
Yeah. This is a tough one, but how does all of this, which seems almost real, touchable, relate to consciousness? What's the connection?
Well, I talk about it as being practical consciousness or applied consciousness, right? Remote viewing itself is you are going out and having these conscious experiences that you then record to make available to be exploited and used, right? And so it's essentially a way of a form of expand consciousness, because what you're doing, first of all, you're demonstrating your consciousness. Obviously, for this to work, your consciousness has to transcend the limits of your skull. This is really prima facie evidence that our minds are literally more than our brains, that we actually have this non-local experience. And that has a lot of implications, which is why science doesn't like this stuff, because it undermines the current paradigm in science, right? So if our minds are more in our brains, well, that means that science has an answer to the story, but it also suggests that the possibility of life after death is very real. So science thinks it's called the book on life after death. You know, when we die, we're dead, right? Well, if our minds can transcend our skulls, if we do have this non-local consciousness, doesn't prove that there's life after death, but it certainly proves that life after death is possible, which science thinks it says is got conclusive proof it isn't. Well, it doesn't have that conclusive proof, and this demonstrates that. That's one thing, right?
The basis of science is everything is physical.
The way we do science, yes. It's actually called physicalism. I wrote my dissertation on this, right? The idea that science believes that everything is physical. Physicalism is the doctrine that everything is physical or a consequence of physical facts, right? Because there are non-physical things that exist only because of the physical, the way physical facts come together. So this stuff is a very blunt counterexample to that metaphysical doctrine. And that's the interesting thing about physicalism. It is a metaphysical doctrine, just like any other metaphysical doctrine. Absolutely. You can't prove physicalism is true. You can't prove it's true. And yet it's taken as if it were, and this stuff is evidence that it's not. So there's another question over here.
Yeah, would the government be concerned about too many people having the ability to remote view and lose their government secrets and everything? Is there some means that the government is keeping people from having these abilities by stuff they add to the water or chemtrails or whatever?
Well, the government would be concerned about it if it believed it was real. But there are people within the government that are convinced it's real. I mean, we were approached by folks during the War on Terror. It's still going on, but less of this is happening because it's not in the news. We were approached by government agents individually to see if we could help them in their mission of fighting the War on Terror. And we had some very positive experiences with those guys, right? Those guys and girls. But that isn't the government. That's just people in the government, right? The government at large doesn't believe in this stuff, and therefore it isn't afraid of it, right? Now, the fact is, most government secrets are pretty boring anyway, and very few remote viewers even care about them. They're more interested in remote viewing UFOs or something, right? You know? So even if they believed in it, I'm not sure they would worry so much about it. Even if they did worry about it, there's nothing they could do about it. Nothing at all. Because if the government were to crack down on remote viewing, all the remote viewers would go underground. You'd never know they were remote viewing.
Right. Yeah.
Sir.
Let's go back to.
I'm not sure how much time we got, but go ahead, ask your question.
Back to Mount Hayes in Alaska. 2 or 3 years ago, Linda Moulton Howe reported that.
So let me hold that thought a second. All right. So Jim's got a question. So it's about Mount Hayes.
Okay. 2 or 3 years ago, Linda Moulton Howe, on Coast to Coast, I think it was, reported that she had been contacted by this naval officer who had, I don't remember if he remote viewed it or in some way looked at a Google map of an area in Alaska, but he claimed that there was a pyramid buried in a certain area, I believe it was close to Mount Denali or somewhere in that area.
Right.
So I don't know if that was close to Mount Hayes or not.
I don't know. And I never heard it, so I don't know what to tell you.
You never did.
I do know there were no naval officers that were military remote viewers. So if he was doing it, he learned it after the fact.
I think he was doing a Google search.
Oh, I got you.
Saw something.
I got you. Okay.
So I was wondering if the area that y'all remote viewed was in that.
I don't know whether it relates. I don't know how it connects with Mount Hayes. I couldn't tell you. Okay. I'd have to get on Google Maps myself. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Has anyone corroborated these 4 locations, these 4, what did you call them? Bases? Actually physically gone there?
Well, I told you one case where Skip Atwater and Joe McMillan went to the Pyrenees location and tried to corroborate it and failed. At least according to Skip, they didn't say anything that was particularly remarkable. There was always talk about folks wanting to go, in the unit we talked about wanting to go here or there and check this stuff out, and it never happened because it was logistically too hard. You know,
Okay.
especially I mean,
Because
going to
they're so remote.
Zimbabwe. No, we're not going to Zimbabwe. You know.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I
They're
don't
so
know.
remote.
Yeah.
They're
So-
remote.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, a couple more questions. Then I don't know. Yeah.
At the end of the Cold War, after the Cold War was over, did American and Soviet remote viewers have a chance to get together and
Yes.
compare notes?
Yes. Ed May and Joe McMonigal have gone over there. They brought some of them over here. Ed May is really kind of the subject matter expert on that. He has a book out now called ESP Wars East and West. And the whole back section of it is written by the Soviet, from the Soviet perspective. And so, yeah, so, you know, and he's got some more work coming out too. It's fairly massive, fairly expensive volumes, but coming out
They
nonetheless.
seem to have any more or less success than we did.
I don't know the answer to that. What I've gleaned from talking to Ed and Joe, they actually didn't end up approaching remote viewing at all the way we were doing it. They were more into offensive operations, such as trying to, and they included their microwave broadcasting stuff under all of this too. So it was not just mental, but it was also physical as well. So you had a question. You've been nobly trying to get it in here.
Yeah, just a quick question. On the remote viewing of the UFOs, was there anything determined about the intention of the occupants, about positive or negative intentions?
In the sessions, I think there was. I don't remember them clear enough. I'd have to go back and make a study. I'm actually thinking about doing a book on this, but I'm not there yet. So,
In your spare time, right?
In my spare time, that's the problem. You know, I'm trying to organize this conference here.
Now I'm going to
and that's-
remote view it. I'm kidding.
So remote viewing, that's an interesting thought. Yeah.
I'll stay at home and do it.
Yeah.
I can't
So,
How would you form a group how would you form a group to really get focused on UFOs without overloading the group?
Well, that's the problem. Yeah, that's a problem. I think it could be done, but it'd take a lot of resources to do it. That's the problem. Remote viewing in its basic form is very cheap and very simple. But when you start getting a complex project, it requires actually quite a few folks to be involved in it to make sure you've got the blinding protocols right, and you've got analysts, and you've got all that kind of stuff. And most people can't dedicate the kind of time that would be needed since they have day jobs. You know, we had the virtue of this was our day job, and so that's why we were able to do it. If I were to have to do it on my own in my own spare time right now, just you know, we wouldn't have accomplished nearly what we were able to accomplish. So anyway, all right, I think I'm going to call it at that. So thank you. And I will be around if you have more questions, but I want you guys to know. Remember, the flyers are out there. If you're interested in the conference, take one so it'll remind you. And I do have the books. Is there somebody at the table, or should I go? Oh, I got to sign them.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you buy a book, I will sign it for you for free. I won't even charge you for the signature. So, okay. So, all right, well, I'll meet you out here then.
Just sign, he'll sign.
Yeah.